Lord Skidelsky thought he was going to be speaking before dinner, and I thought I was going to be speaking after dinner. So I've taken a somewhat lighter approach, and given that it's perhaps a little later than we anticipated, maybe it will be to your suiting. What I wanted to talk about tonight first was simply the Hayek-Keynes relationship. I think that it's often caricatured as a that they were always fighting. In fact, their intellectual relationship was quite interesting, and I wanted to start out with that. And after that, I'll go to some things that I think Hayek might have of interest today, some things that he said then that would be of interest today, and then I'll close with just some remarks that well, you'll see what they are. The first thing I wanted to clear up was something that we saw in the video clip. Keynes did air raid duty, and Hayek did air raid duty. But when Hayek did air raid duty, he did it with John Clapham. This is one of the wonderful myths that grew up, and it was one of the things that I saw when I saw, this was from Commanding Heights, I think, this particular clip. And I can remember thinking, boy, that's the one thing that they really, that they just got wrong in that. And unfortunately, it was such a great scene. Of course, it's a great story. So, unfortunately, an untrue one. Just wanted to clear that up. Well, okay, the first surprise about the relationship between Hayek and Keynes was that Keynes was actually one of Hayek's heroes when Hayek was a young man after World War I. This was because of Keynes's fiery condemnation of the Carthaginian terms of the Versailles Treaty in his economic consequences of the peace. His phrase, "the murder of Vienna," was something that was from that book that Hayek, certainly it would have resonated with him. The winters right after World War I were particularly cold and harsh. About a decade later, though, Hayek and Keynes crossed swords, and it's really a great story, this story about the treatise and Hayek's review of it, so I thought I'd tell that. In 1931, Hayek was invited to the London School of Economics to give 4 lectures on monetary theory, and the lectures were published the next year as the book Prices and Production. And people who attended the lecture said afterwards to him, when you were lecturing, you were reading from notes, and we couldn't understand a word you were saying. But when you started to answer questions, you were actually quite coherent. And we're talking about academics here, so I mean, of course, nothing's quite so impressive as someone who's usually incoherent but occasionally very clear. So anyway, in any event, they offered him a job. Okay, so he took a job at the LSE. And in the summer of that year, even before he started teaching, he does his review of Keynes's new book, A Treatise on Money. Now, Keynes had been working on this book all through the 1920s. He was hoping it would establish his career as a monetary theorist, and the review initiated their grand debate. And it was a really fierce debate. It was quite unprecedented. One of Keynes's fellow Cambridge economists chastised him in print afterwards, likening his assault on Hayek to body line bowling. Now, a few people who play cricket are in the audience, so this is where the bowler goes after the person's body rather than the wicket. So this is a strong statement, I think. Striking metaphor is what I put here, but I just couldn't say that. Okay, so the grounds for the debate, anyway, were quite complicated, as Lord Skidelsky pointed out, but in another sense, it was quite simple. Both men, in their respective theories, had drawn on the work of a Swedish economist named Knut Wicksell. And Wicksell wrote in German. And Hayek, of course, read German. Keynes read German, okay? He just barely read German. In fact, in the treatise, he actually makes the following fatally self-deprecating remark. He says, "In German, I can only clearly understand what I know already." Great remark, a typical Keynes, I mean, delightful, but not the right time to do it. With this casual remark, Keynes, it was like painting a bullseye on the cover of the book. Hayek's critique was that Keynes had only borrowed certain elements of the Wickelsian framework, had left aside the capital theoretical elements, These elements were, of course, important in Hayek's work. So Hayek's review was basically saying, look, you borrowed some nice things from Wicksell, but you didn't really tell the full story. And Hayek was very polite in his review, but he was very direct. The Swede Gunnar Myrdal was less flattering. He called Keynes's book an example of the British penchant for unnecessary originality, which I thought was a interesting quote. Okay, so let's get the picture clear. Keynes was a Cambridge Don. He was the editor of the Economic Journal, a major public figure in England. Hayek was 31 years old, 16 years younger than him. He was a nobody from some other country. And this was all taking place just as the downturn of 1930 was becoming the Great Depression. So the stakes were really high. Now, Keynes was apoplectic about the review, as was mentioned. As is usual in the academic world, the way you express displeasure is you write a response. It was published a few months later. And in it, what Keynes did was not simply defend his own views, but in his reply to Hayek's review, started to attack Hayek's own book. And it was really a brilliant attack. And Keynes was one of the, he's a lovely writer to read. And so I just want to quote one of the best lines, one of the juiciest lines. This is talking about Hayek's book. The book as it stands seems to me to be one of the most frightful muddles I have ever read, with scarcely a sound proposition in it. It's an extraordinary example of how, starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in bedlam. Just love that line. So, both men eventually left the battle to work on new books. Keynes finished first with the General Theory, of course, most famous and influential book, I think it's clear, in the 20th century. Hayek actually worked, both of them, I think, came away from the battle thinking they needed to do something else. They needed to fix their initial theories. And Hayek actually worked from 1933. There's evidence in the archives that he started this new book in 1933 until it was finally published in 1941. And it was The Pure Theory of Capital. And I've read this book. And frankly, it's virtually unreadable. And in any case, it was very little read because it was 1941, the war had started. Hayek made his fame a little later, obviously, with The Road to Serfdom. Now, once the war had begun, the Keynes-Hayek relationship improved dramatically. Keynes actually got Hayek rooms here in Keynes. The LSE evacuated up to Cambridge, and Keynes helped him find a place to stay. Just before the war started, Keynes had written a pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, and Hayek came out with a very strong, positive review. They were basically very much in agreement on those points of war finance. This is somewhat remarkable. A lot of people have commented on this. It's always hard to know what letters mean, but something that usually would surprise people is you think of The Road to Serfdom. Well, while he was on the way to Bretton Woods, Keynes read The Road to Serfdom and sent Hayek a letter. And I'll quote a little bit from it. It says, "You'll not expect me to accept quite all the economic dicta in it, but morally and philosophically I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and not only in agreement with it, but in deeply moved agreement." A rather remarkable line. Hayek, for his part, said in a later interview when asked to name the two people with whom he'd most like to have dinner and conversation with, he said, well, that's obvious. First Keynes and second Schumpeter. So I think their relationship was actually much more interesting than is usually portrayed. Okay, so I'll switch gears now and talk a little bit about what we might learn from Hayek. I'll just talk very briefly about the cause of the business cycle, since Lord Skidelsky had mentioned it. I think we do need to clear up any, if there is any perception, I don't think it should be, after Lord Skidelsky's talk, that Hayek thought that free market economies just work perfectly, we can get rid of it right away. His first book was Monetary Theory in the Trade Cycle. It was explicitly saying, indeed, free market economies have a problem. The problem is money. Money is the loose joint. So they're both in full agreement on that. And I think Lord Skidelsky is right. He described in general the The Hayekian vision is that when interest rates are kept too low for too long, there's a buildup of investment goods. It's malinvestment. Hayek wasn't thinking about housing. He was thinking about other sorts of investment. And the general idea then is once this occurs and it's recognized, the investment collapses, a recession begins, and in Hayek's theory, recessions are the painful but necessary adjustment that returns the system back to equilibrium. His policy advice at the time, simply to let the system adjust, was not popular then, and it's not popular now. His great fear was that attempts to combat recession with expansionary policy would perpetuate the malinvestment, delay the necessary and painful process of adjustment, and set up the prospect of future inflation. And these are, again, things that you've heard some people argue today. Now, I think of more interest than his cycle theory in the current environment are Hayek's views on regulation and on the limitations of economics as a science. Regarding regulation, two things should be noted at the outset. First of all, he wasn't opposed to all regulation. He actually, if you read him from 33 on, he always said, let me be clear, I oppose laissez-faire. Now, we can go into a discussion of what exactly he meant by that, but this was something that he maintained throughout this period. And second, and this makes it a little harder to interpret him, he was no policy wonk. All of his observations were always made at a very general level. And I wondered about why this was. You know, you study somebody for a long time, you wonder what's going on. And here's the conjecture that I've come up with. He founded the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, a society of liberals. And this group had people from one extreme to the other, perhaps on the furthest extreme with Ludwig von Mises. Then there was the Chicago school people like Friedman and George Stigler, and then people who were from Germany like Walter Eucken, Ordo liberals, and then people like Karl Polanyi and Karl Popper, who in this group anyway would be viewed as social democrats. And he would be trying to keep this group together. So he would avoid specifics when he talked. He wasn't always successful. Mises walked out of one of the very first sessions of the Mont Pelerin Society saying, "You're all a bunch of socialists," which is quite an extraordinary remark in that group. So anyway, what he has to say is at a very general level. We'll see if we can get something from it. Hayek's starting point, his most fundamental insight, concerns the limits of our knowledge. For Hayek, knowledge was both dispersed and subjectively held, the latter implying that some of what people think they know is wrong. Now, the question in such a world is, what sort of system works best to coordinate people's dispersed knowledge and help them correct their mistakes? This was his general starting point. Now, in coming up with an answer, Hayek talked about the crucial role of freely adjusting market prices, prices that signal individual decision makers about relative scarcities and movements in which inform people when they've made mistakes. Now, to be sure, he was writing before the extensive literature on the economics of information, with its emphasis on increasing returns, path dependency, and the like, had been developed. That said, Hayekian-inspired responses to that literature have begun to be developed. I just will alert you to a British academic named Mark Pennington, who I've just received a manuscript from, who is coming out with a book that tries to address some of those issues. In any event, Hayek always insisted that if a market system of the type he described was to work effectively, it has to be embedded in a complementary set of social institutions. These would be a democratic polity with well-defined and enforced property rights, strong constitutional protections of a private sphere of activity, all operating under the rule of law. Whenever he discussed legislation, he always talked about it within that sort of general framework, general system of rules, and emphasized that a free market system by itself is not going to be sufficient. It needs to be embedded in these other social institutions. So I think these general topics have implications for the kinds of legislation one might be prepared to implement. In the first instance, he opposed, of course, policies that involved either price fixing or constraints on entry and exit, because these interfere with the ability of a price system to reflect relative scarcities. Because it's such a big player, he also emphasized how government, through its actions, and sometimes even through its proposed actions, can interfere with ordinary people's abilities to make decisions. As he wrote in The Road to Serfdom, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. Hayek worried, too, about whether regulators would have the requisite knowledge to keep up with the ever-changing ebb and flow of the market process. Entrepreneurs, this is the Austrian emphasis on entrepreneurial activity, are always forward-looking. Now, this applies also to people who are trying to anticipate how to get around regulations, okay? Whereas regulators, in Hayek's view, are always backward-looking by necessity. They're trying to overcome problems that have occurred in the past. Hayek also asked Juvenal's question, who is to regulate or to watch over the regulators, something that I think has some resonance today. Now, in addition to these knowledge problems, Hayek worried that certain types of regulation tend to increase moral hazard to misalign incentives. He specifically warned about situations in which firms were considered too big to fail. He did this writing in the 1970s. I think he had the Chrysler firm in the United States in mind. Of course, 30 years later, geez, well, here we have it. For Hayek, the market process itself, when it's allowed to work, actually provides some forms of regulation, namely the market discipline that results from a consumer choice, rivalrous competition, the carrot of profits, the stick of losses. The recent socialization of losses for firms viewed as too big to fail would, of course, been viewed as anathema by this staunch anti-socialist. Now, taken by itself, Hayek's message about the limits of our knowledge suggests the difficulty of securing adequate regulation. If one links it up with other arguments about the nature of the political process, for example, those that are associated with the public choice school, Jim Buchanan, one's confidence that the political process will yield the right policy, even if we knew what it was, is also chastened. Hayek's message regarding the prospects for effective regulation, then, is it's depressing. It's pessimistic, sobering. Now, I'd like to close with two further points. I was initially attracted to Hayek. Phil's not going to believe this. We always fight about this. But I was initially attracted to Hayek not for his politics, nor for his ideas about markets, but for his methodological views, and in particular for what he had to say about the limitations of economics. Hayek developed his ideas about the dispersion of knowledge during the socialist calculation debates of the 1930s. His ideas led him to reject, of course, the assumption of perfect information that inhabited most of the models of his day, but also the rationality assumption, and eventually even the use of equilibrium theorizing, which is one reason he's not taught in economics curricula. He just went away from that kind of modeling. Indeed, in terms of methodology, the Austrians have more in common with at least certain variants of post-Keynesian thought, especially those associated with George Shackle, than either of them does with the mainstream. And again, this is to agree with what Lord Skidelsky said. Hayek's takeaway message is that the economy is a complex adaptive system, and that when we confront such a phenomenon, our ability to control it is severely limited. Often the best we can do is to make broad pattern predictions or provide explanations of the principles by which such phenomena behave. Hayek's views, if correct, also imply severe limitations on our ability to adjudicate among rival theories. This fallibilist conclusion is evident in a paper he first published back in 1955. I'm going to read from it, and I think it's a great paragraph. It's a little long. But if it's true that in subjects of great complexity we must rely to a large extent on such mere explanations of the principle, we must not overlook some disadvantages connected with the technique. Because such theories are difficult to disprove, the elimination of inferior rival theories will be a slow affair, bound up closely with the argumentative skill and persuasiveness of those who employ them. There can be no crucial experiments which decide between them. There'll be opportunity for grave abuses, possibilities for pretentious, over-elaborate theories, which no simple test, but only the good sense of those competent in the field can refute. There will be no safeguards even against sheer quackery. Constant awareness of these dangers is probably the only effective precaution, but it does not help to hold up against this the example of other sciences where the situation is different. It's not because of a failure to follow better counsel, but because of the refractory nature of certain subjects that these difficulties arise. There's no basis for the contention that they're due to the immaturity of the science concerned. It would be a complete misunderstanding of the argument of this essay to think that it deals with the provisional and transitory state of the progress of those sciences which they are bound to overcome sooner or later. He doesn't think it's going to change. Hayek's words, if we take them as representing something true, explain why progress has been so slow in economics, why very bright people can still continue to disagree about the best way forward, and why it will ever be so. The hoped-for effect of this is to make us a bit more humble about our proposals, like Keynes dentists, I would say. My final observation is that this is the first conference ever to bring together the leading lights from the economics profession with policymakers and with historians of economic thought. I thank George Soros and Rob Johnson sincerely for this. The one thing that the leading fresh and saltwater economists gathered here this weekend share in common is that none of them, and if I'm wrong, I would be delighted to be contradicted on this, teaches in a department that offers graduate courses in the history of economic thought. Studying the history of economics can have the same effect as taking Hayek's ideas about the limits of economics seriously. It makes one humble about what one thinks one knows, and that might not be such a bad thing for the economics profession. Thank you very much.